How's it going, guys? Welcome to another Soul Encoded tutorial. Today we're going to be covering functions in JavaScript. Let's get to the first section of the lesson. In JavaScript, functions are considered first-class citizens. What that means is that you can pass functions as values, you could assign them into variables, and etc. You could also return functions. But before we talk more about that, let's first start with section number 1 by defining a function. So, defining a function. How do you do that? Simple. You use a keyword function. You can write a name afterwards. So let's follow our example and create an add function. And then inside here, you could return a plus b. So I just created a simple add function. All it is doing is it's using the keyword function, and then we are naming it add, and we're passing two parameters, a and b, and it's returning the summation of a and b. Very simple, right? So, but the cool thing about functions in JavaScript is that you could assign them to variables. So instead of calling the function name add, let's assign an anonymous function that does the add behavior and then assign it into a variable called add. So let me go and do that. Function a comma b, return a plus b. Now this is essentially the same thing. This is essentially the same thing as the above behavior. And actually, if we invoke add here, 1 plus 2. Now let's first comment out this section, console log add. Let's console log add here, and that should give us the number 3. Now let's uncomment out this top function named add, and instead let's use the same behavior, but the function that's called add, that was assigned to a variable called add. Let's try that. And there you go, 3. The same behavior, but the difference is like this variable could be named something totally different. For example, super add, right? And then down here we need to call it super add. Actually, let's uncomment the first section and then call this super add, and then give it a different number, 2. And then let's print out both. Now it should have a 3 and 4. And now we have two different add functions that are named different things, but one is defined a different way. So that's a very simple example of how to define functions in JavaScript. Now that was defining a function, let's move on to the next section. Section number 2 is parameters and scopes. We have actually used parameters and the concept of scopes already many times in our programs. But for example and demonstration's sakes, let's go through it one more time. So let's create a function called myName or print name that takes in a parameter name and returns a new string with your name in it, right? So let's say it's my name is, and then name. So when you console log the invocation of this print name with a particular name, it should give you the name with the string. So it should print that out, right? My name is John. Now, in terms of how scopes and parameters work, first of all, the parameters is right here, name. So the name is considered a parameter. It's basically saying that in this particular function, we're expecting a parameter or a value called name to be passed into it. And down here, we're passing a string John into where this particular name parameter is expecting. Now, what is scope? We had actually already created a scope here, but let me create kind of a nested scope to give you a better understanding of what scope actually is.
Let's define some variables outside. So outside var equals 1, just for demonstration purposes, and then we can say function inside func, and then outside param, and then here let's create another function even more inside func. And then here we'll say inside param. Let's also create an inside param here and put this as 2. Now, And finally down here we'll say even more inside param variable, which equals 3.
Alrighty, so we have a few things here going. Let's go ahead and console log even more inside var here. Let's also console log inside param here, and let's console log the outside var here. So I did this really quickly just to demonstrate things. The naming is all kind of funky, but let's kind of go through what a scope is. Now I'm gonna highlight what's called the global scope, and which is this outside layer which has everything, right? And what's available in the outside scope is this variable outside var equals 1, and also this invocation happens in the outside scope, the console log outside var. The first scope that we have here is this inside func, and each scope is denoted by these curly braces, and you could kind of tell where they are by the indentation of the function. But inside func has its own scope, and then the even more inside func has its own scope. So the variable even inside var is only available right here inside of this particular code, inside the even more inside func scope. And that's all scope is. Just imagine that you're encapsulating portions of your code base so that only certain portions of the functions that you're writing can see that particular variables or methods or whatever that's inside that scope. One thing to note is that functions that are deep nested inside have access to its parent and so forth scope. So for example, even more inside func has access to outside var. So if we console log outside var here, it would actually be able to go up and find outside var. However, if we went down here and try to console log even more inside var, the global scope outside cannot go inside, cannot go down into the scope. So this would error out. So let's play around a little bit and invoke some of this. When I'm looking at this, since I'm only console logging this outside var right here, it will print 1 right now, right? And it does as expected. But let's invoke the inside function, inside func, and then let's pass in that outside var. Now it should actually print out the inside param, which is right here in 2, and then it prints out 1 and it prints out 2. Now this is the next part that I wanted to get to. We just invoked the inside func, but what if we want to invoke the even more inside func? So let's try it here, even more inside func. Now note that we are doing this in a state that's outside of the inside func. And note that the even more inside func is only available inside of the inside func. Sorry, tongue twisters. So because of this, we'll probably not get any results. So let's delete all the other invocations and see what this gives us. So it gives us an error, right? It says reference error, even inside func is not defined, which makes sense, right? So instead, let's move this invocation up to right here, which is inside the inside func. So now it has access to the even inside func, but to invoke that, we actually have to invoke the inside func. And there you go. We have 2 and then 3, and then it's printing out these values right here. So here's the thing about scopes. Scopes are super important. Most programmers that are starting out, the number 1 errors that they make usually occur in scopes. You saw the reference does not exist kind of error, right? And that usually happens when programmers are not being careful of where their values are stored, what scope the value is in. So look out for that, because that will definitely be one of your number 1 issues of why you have errors. Anyways,
moving on to the next. So the next section is actually nested scopes, but we just went over an example with a bunch of nested scopes. I did both of the lessons there, so I hope you're able to follow along. If not, you could always read the write-up. Moving on.
Right now, let's create a function. Will this work? And then let's console log. Why does this work? With this function created, but let's invoke it above where it was declared. Let's work. Now, how much do you guys want to bet that this will work versus not? The answer is it will actually work. Why does this work? Gets logs and everything's working. So how does this happen? Why does will this work function even work when the function was invoked above where it was declared? The reason why is because JavaScript does not do its declarations like every other code. It doesn't go step from top to bottom. JavaScript is compiling, it goes through the entire code base, the entire file, finds all of the variable and function declarations, and hoists it up to the top. So where you have it into the code base doesn't actually really matter. So this particular example, although it's written like this, in reality when it's executed, the will this work function would have been already declared, and therefore will this work invocation is running without errors. It's kind of a funny tidbit, but look out for that. In practice though, I would highly recommend you guys to write your declarations at the top where you intend to. So try your best to avoid the natural hoisting behavior of JavaScript, because code that you could reason about easily is the best code that you could write. Moving on.
Now let's go over optional arguments. We have already gone over arguments, but there's such things as optional arguments. This is another interesting behavior that JavaScript has. Some other languages has it as well, but for JavaScript, this is kind of a feature in a way. Let's dive into an example right now.
Let's create a roll dice function. Function roll dice, or roll die, and then let's pass it a certain number of faces. So it could be D20, D6, D4, what have you. And then let's return basically a random number that is possible based on the faces that it has. So to do that, we do math.floor, and we do math.random, and then so what this does is gives us a number from 0 to 1, a floating point number. And then we multiply that by the number of faces, and then we add 1 to it. So what this should do is essentially give us a random number from 0 to 1. We're multiplying that by the amount of face that we have, and then we're adding 1. So the reason why we are adding 1 is because the number could be 0, right? Then that would give us a 0 value. Therefore, we need to go up at least minimum of 1, right? So here we're returning it. So let's log this. Roll dice, and then let's give it, and then we got 6 luckily. Let's try it again. 6 again. Did I mess up? No. 5. Okay, what if we don't pass anything in? What happens? We get a not a number error. This is because this particular example assumes that we're passing in a variable. But in JavaScript, we could do something interesting where we default an optional argument as well. So if we do 6, like so, we're saying has a default value, and therefore it could also be optional as well. Again, you could do something like name, right? The name of the person. This doesn't do anything right now, and this is strictly considered an optional argument. But in JavaScript, when you pass an optional argument, and you don't pass that argument with it, it automatically assumes that value is undefined. But for now, I'm showing you guys optional argument and also how to default an argument. So now, let's do 2 roll dices of D20 and then not pass anything. So the first particular example will give us something between 1 to 20, and the next example should be 1 to 6, and it does. But yeah, that's how you do optional arguments in a nutshell. Moving on.
So yeah, I'm gonna stop this particular section here because next section is we're gonna be covering closures and recursions. And I believe that's one of the most commonly misunderstood sections for beginning programmers. So I want to devote an entire video to it. But for this particular video, there's still challenges associated to it. So the challenge is called variable functions and also my scope, your scope. So the first challenge is basically you have to create two different types of functions. Functions that has a name associated with it and another function that is assigned to a variable with an anonymous function attached to it. Very simple. The second one may be a little bit more challenging. I had created a function with multiple scopes, with nested scopes, that has a certain behavior. And I want you to essentially fix that function so that all the logs are working properly as intended. So yeah, I hope you can finish that particular challenge successfully and then join me in the next video. Thank you.